Thank you. So, yeah, welcome. First of all, a big thank you for all of you coming here, especially the non-Armenians. I know this is very West London. Thank you to Haisha and Misak for inviting me. And so, my name is Maxim Saakyan, so feel free just to call me Max. Today's event is going to focus on two main aspects: Aurora Mardiganian and, in a way, how I produced her story, and the importance of archiving, and basically using Aurora as a case study for this. So, what is Uncovering Roots, and how did it come about exactly? So, Uncovering Roots is a project / podcast audio documentary where we focus on the SWANA region. So this is Southwest Asia and North Africa, and this is where Armenia tends to lie in this group. One of the things that has bothered me at times is I tend to just hear kind of Western stories, or if they're not just Western stories, they tend to come with a very heavily Western influence or from the Western eye. And I'm a firm believer that creating something creative and engaging is the best way of teaching people, whether it's about art, culture, history, practically anything. So the aim of the podcast is to honor and teach. Honor those stories that we tell, and also teach people about the region. So this comes to, I realized I didn't do this. Wow. This comes to the first story of this podcast, Aurora Mardiganian. Now, what drew me to tell her story? To be honest, I sometimes get tired of explaining about the Armenian Genocide, and to be honest, I don't do it justice enough. It's very, very difficult to sometimes empathize with numbers if we're talking about 1.52 million people who died. So I try to think, how do people show empathy? It tends to be more personal stories, human stories. Examples include, for example, Anne Frank. Another example, maybe slightly more recently, was Alan Kurdi, the Kurdish boy that washed up. Suddenly people cared a little bit more about the refugee crisis. And in addition to this, the UK government doesn't recognise the Armenian Genocide. So part of this was also trying to, in a way, somewhat convince the UK kind of population about this story. And within the podcast, we also kind of invited an MP to see if, is Armenian genocide recognition possible in our lifetime or not. So I started researching her story. And it took me 18 months to try and get everything together. Slight context to it for those who don't know her story at all. She was an Armenian genocide survivor at a very young age, and then in the end came to America. And she kind of became a Hollywood star based on her own experiences, and she played the main actress in the film. And when you type in Aurora Mardiganian on, let's say, Google, you see the book that we'll talk about slightly later, and the film as well, and then a couple of other aspects to it. But the information is very much completely scattered. We don't really have something where you can go onto, let's say, one link, learn about everything, great. So that's also something I wanted to create. It took me a very long time. I was also trying to figure out who Aurora was. So she's not just defined by a genocide survivor, and that's it. So I interviewed about 22 people, had 40 hours worth of interviews, which was a long time to get through all of those testimonies, photos, newspaper clippings, court papers, and finally we kind of saw what and who Aurora was. And to start this, I suppose, first chapter, she was just a teenage girl going through the genocide, aged 14.
As the war grew ever closer to these small towns of Western Armenia, the Mardigians were visited one night by a Kurdish shepherd who warned them of approaching danger. Despite this warning, Arshalus's father was reluctant to leave, worried that fleeing would justify the Ottomans in punishing other Armenians. Arshalus remembers him stating, "If I run, I'd be a coward. If I must die, I'll die in my own home." But the coming danger arrived quicker than they could prepare for, and within a few days the Ottoman soldiers had taken over the small town, ordering all men over the age of 18 to assemble in the public square. Arshalus and her siblings embraced their father, hugging him for what they hoped wasn't the last time. As he left the house, a brother Porhos followed their father at a distance just to be near him. Porhos was spotted by the soldiers and ordered to line up along with the rest of the Armenian men. They never returned from the town square. Day by day, week by week, as the march continued, Archelaus came to realise these same horrors were happening everywhere as they passed through towns where every Armenian was dragged from their homes. Ordinary Turkish people also came to the camps late at night. The soldiers sold what little of value the women had brought with them: jewellery, rugs, trinkets, and worse, many of the girls and young women were sold off as slaves. As the marches continued across the desert, Archelaus witnessed unspeakable horrors. After walking for many weeks, those who had survived this far reached the Euphrates River. Archelaus remembers the enormous and collective relief from many of the Armenians as they realised they were finally able to drink plentiful water. They ran toward the river, eager to drink, and then stopped in horror. There were bodies in the water, thousands of dead Armenian bodies, many dismembered and broken, all floating slowly through the current of the river. The Euphrates had turned into a mass grave.
Before the desert, there was water that lake, like something was passing by away. I don't know what you call that. At that time, I wouldn't be able to tell. But it was with water, and the bodies were coming right into that water.
They were floating in the water?
Floating, and they were arms, and they were head cut off, and the legs
Parts of bodies.
Parts of the bodies, all the Armenians, they were from Harput, they call it Euphrates River, as they call it. Probably that was the river that was coming that way to reach to the desert.
The Euphrates River.
Yeah, what kind?
Euphrates River?
Yeah, Euphrates. Euphrates River. We call it Euphrates. English Euphrates.
2 years under occupation, 2 years worth of escaping. Some of the stories were insane, nearly all of them brutal. One of the most brutal moments were when she reached the Euphrates River. They went on a boat with the Ottoman soldiers, and one by one the Ottoman soldiers started just throwing the kids out of the boat, including her sisters. And that was basically the last we heard of her sisters during what she went through during those 2 years. It's very difficult trying to find this kind of middle ground between kind of showing the brutality of the genocide, but at the same time not traumatizing the audience's mind too much, because the aim of this podcast is to try and teach people. We don't want people to just put their headphones away and go, this was too much, I can only do 10-15 minutes of this. So it's a difficult thing to track down. And just on that snippet, that was of course Aurora speaking with the Armenian Film Foundation based in California. I think that this was in the 80s also. And the first bit, Avi Zakarian, a good friend of ours, she narrated Aurora's story early on. But she was just 14 years old, and after 2 years, she escaped numerous times, and she managed to outsmart adults. She managed to outsmart her captors. And she marched on and found some Russian soldiers. In the end, they took her to Tbilisi, and she met with General Andranik. Now, the Armenians in this room, of course, know who General Andranik, I'm sure, is. Arguably the most famous Armenian general known. And he had one message for her: to tell the world about the Armenian genocide. So she traveled to St. Petersburg, and then just as she was traveling there, the Bolshevik Revolution started. So it took her 2 months to try and actually get out of that, and then in the end managed to go to Oslo, and then finally to New York.
She was taken in by an Armenian couple when she arrived. They helped her post news advertisements in search of her brother Bahan, whom she believed to be living in the States. She had interviews with the New York Sun and the New York Tribune, which were published alongside these advertisements. Her story piqued the interest of writer Henry Layford Gates. Henry and his wife wife Eleanor soon became her legal guardians. After becoming her legal guardians, they changed her name to a more anglicised version, Aurora Mardiganian. One of the leaders of the humanitarian organisation that helped her get to the US met with Aurora. They offered her a place in a boarding school, but even as a young teenager, she put the Armenians ahead of herself. She told them how she would love to study music at school, but she now had a different purpose in life: to deliver the message from her suffering nation to the people of the United States. Henry Gates set up headquarters at New York's Lambton Hotel for Aurora, just months after she escaped the Ottomans. Aurora didn't speak much English, and Gates didn't know any Armenian. Through short oral installments, Aurora recounted her story in Armenian, which was translated into English, transcribed, and then edited by Henry Gates. During one of the days when Aurora was recounting her story, she was asked what hurt more: her witnessing the murder of her family, or seeing the slaughter of the Armenian nation.
Which one do you think that hurt you more? Well, I said that's a hard question. The people of my nation, I said, in Armenian I talk. And then the man is translating, see? So then I said, my people is my nation. My nation is go, then no more Armenian. And my people hurt just as much as my parents hurt me just as much as my people.
After recounting her tragic story through Henry Gates and the translator, the book of Ravished Armenia was complete and published in 1980. Although finding an original copy of the book is challenging, it had wide distribution in both America and Britain. Anthony Sly, an expert on the book, thinks that over 1 million copies were sold in America alone, while in Britain, the 13th edition of the book sold over 350,000 copies. In fact, the book was translated into many different languages across the world. It was very popular in South America, specifically Argentina, where there is a large Armenian diaspora living in the country. Other countries include Cuba, Mexico, and even Japan.
Okay, so we're nearing basically the end of this chapter 1 of Aurora, and I basically have 3 things I'm working with right now. I'm working with the book that we just talked about in that snippet. We have the testimony that we've heard Aurora a few times, and then we have a university essay piece from a friend of Aurora's. Now, I wasn't allowed to use anything which was on there, but it was still very useful in terms of cross-checking all these stories, because of course we have to make sure that we kind of in a way fact-check these stories. Now, one question I wanted to ask all of you is, what do you think a potential problem could be, for example, with the book? Do you think anyone has any ideas? Don't be shy.
Lost in translation?
Lost in translation, yeah. And what's the purpose tends to be for a publisher? Tends to be to make money, right? So we also have to be careful to make sure that not potentially all of these stories might be true. And this was especially the case with the film. Now, we have the full kind of script, and inside the film, Aurora has a love interest. There was, of course, no love interest while she was going through kind of 2 years of horror. Another thing with the film, for example, you have, if you type in Auction of Souls or Ravished Armenia, the first thing that pops up are women on crosses. That didn't happen. What happened was kind of a lot more gruesome. But thankfully, these 3 cooperated quite well. The main things that were missing tended to be specific location, which again is completely understandable when someone is forced to move from place to place to place. And then we move on to kind of the chapter 2 of the story. So the next snippet, it's slightly longer, it's around like 6 minutes, and it's of Anthony Slide, who's a silent movie expert, who met with Aurora. Now, most people who talk to Aurora, like the testimonies, for example, they want to find out kind of what happened to you during the genocide. But Anthony Slide, with him being a film expert, he was more actually wondering, like, how did the filming take place? Like, what happened? Because this was a very, like, sensational film. And yeah, Aurora recounts a lot.
They showed me some paper to sign. I said, I don't know what in that paper is that I'm going to sign. I don't understand my own language much. I don't understand your English. I don't know. You have to have somebody to explain to me. And then I will sign that paper. Then Mardiganian and his brother will come to the hotel and they tell you all about what is that was a contract they made. That they were going to California to make the film. So then, when they explained it to me, my brother, Mrs. Gay, said to me, Aurora, we're going to go to California, and then you're going to see the picture taken. What picture? I thought I always have people taking my picture all the time, not like this picture. So then I said, that's good. In the hotel place, and then the hotel place waited for me and sitting until 3 days after that they would bring me to the Hollywood. First Los Angeles, they took me to the city zoo.
Do you remember how much they paid you to appear in the film?
No, they said that we will give you $15 to make the film in the contract.
$15?
15.
That's all?
That's all.
$15 a week?
No, yes, $15 a week.
A week?
Yes, $15 a week. And then they said that $15, I didn't understand it. Then the Armenian was saying, I said, well, that's good, $15.
Traveled across the world, and it broke box office records everywhere in the States.
Despite the censorship problems, the film broke box office records, a fact that not many people are really aware of. When the film opened in the Washington Theatre in Detroit in 1919, it broke all box office records in the city. This is despite the city's slight censorship of only letting those over the age of 21. Box office records were similarly broken in Dayton, Ohio in early January. In fact, as one newspaper said, the film shattered all previous box office records, that there had to be another showing in the future. You can even see pictures of the endless queue in front of the theatre. People were desperate to see this film. Aurora made personal appearances at each screening. There were even morning performances for ladies only, where Aurora went into more detail about the experiences of the women during the genocide. We don't have the exact numbers, but Anthony Slide thinks that around 10 million Americans saw the production. But despite the fame, she was completely alone. She was without her family and friends, and her life became promoting the film. The constant public appearances for Aurora became too much for just one individual to handle. There was even talk of sending Aurora, who was clearly traumatized and still a teenager, to London to appear at the British screenings in 1920. She made her last personal appearance with the film in Buffalo, New York in May 1920, where she painted.
As I said, the film did exceptionally well. It travelled everywhere, from Japan, Australia, South America. It went through quite a few countries there. And I thought that was the audio for a second. And also in London, as I said, so it showed at Royal Albert Hall for 3 weeks straight, day and evening performances every single day. You know, it was a sensational film. But after she fainted, Henrietta Eleanor Gates sent her to a convent and basically locked her up. And what they did was they hired 7 Aurora lookalikes without telling anyone, and they travelled with the film. So the entire world thought that Aurora was still in fine health, and she was still able to come to all these performances and do her kind of talks and speeches. So Aurora went through kind of one last escape. She climbed the gates of a convent and ran and went to New York and met with her good friend who was relatively high up in the Near East Relief organization. This organization basically helped fund the film, but also helped Aurora a lot when she first arrived to the States. And she was also in shock. She had no idea, so not even Near East Relief knew about these lookalikes at all. And this is where suddenly we see Aurora kind of get a bit more empowered with this. And in a way, this is a little bit of chapter 3 where we actually figure out who Aurora was as a person. And this is also where we kind of dig into the archives a tiny bit more. She decides to sue her guardian. She decides to sue Eleanor Gates. As we can see by the title, Armenian refugee got $15 a week at start of film play. Again, also good in the sense of confirming that the $15 a week was very much true fact. Girl says Guardian saved only $195 of $7,000 paid for production, aka she was owed $7,000 and she was only given $195. Also with the $15 a week, just to put it into context in terms of how much that was, it was to actually pay for a ticket for some of those cinemas, it was pretty expensive. It was $10 a ticket, which is, I'd say, quite expensive even now, a tiny bit. We'd probably choose like a Barbican Monday to have a fiver. So yeah, this $15 was practically nothing. But she sued, and Eleanor Gates tried to say kind of, the reason we had to spend all that $7,000 was because we had to get chauffeurs and we had to get the lookalikes, etc. Thankfully, the judge wasn't having any of it, and Aurora won the case, and she got the $7,000 she should have had before. And then I wanted to do some more digging. I was like, if there's court proceedings, it tends to mean that there's also some more kind of archives out there, which isn't just newspaper clippings. So then I found this, and this is basically again confirmation that Eleanor Gates was the guardian of Aurora. I kept on digging, and I managed to find this, and these were more court proceedings back in August 1920. And I was reading, I think I got sent about 40 pages worth of things, and quite a few interesting things, but then something really stuck out to me, and it was, the petition of Aurora Mardiganian respectfully shows, point 3, that your petitioner is without funds and without employment at this time, as a result of which she has become indebted for room and board for herself and for certain tuition charges at the school where her sister is attending. I didn't understand fully what that sentence was, but I definitely understood the very last bit, where her sister is attending. In the book, we see basically her sisters perishing when they got thrown off the board, as I mentioned earlier. With the Armenian Film Foundation, she doesn't mention her sisters, and the friends I spoke to also really didn't mention her sisters. There's also one more archive at the Zorian Institute in Canada. They also did a testimony with her. Sadly, I can't access the archive. You have to be in Canada and also have special permission.
This slide thinks that around 10 million Americans saw the production. But despite the fame, she was completely alone. She was without her family and friends, and her life became promoting the film. The constant public appearances for Aurora became too much for just one individual to handle. There was even talk of sending Aurora, who was clearly traumatized and still a teenager, to London to appear at the British screens in 1920. She made her last personal appearance with the film in Buffalo, New York in May 1920, where she ended.
So, as I said, the film did exceptionally well. It travelled everywhere, from Japan, Australia, South America. It went through quite a few countries there. And I thought that was the audio. And also in London, as we said, so it showed at the Royal Albert Hall for 3 weeks straight, day and evening performances every single day. You know, it was a sensational film. But after she fainted, Henry and Eleanor Gates sent her to a convent and basically locked her up. And what they did was they hired 7 Aurora lookalikes without telling anyone, and they travelled with the film. So the entire world thought that Aurora was still in fine health, And she was still able to come to all these performances and do her kind of talks and speeches. So Aurora went through kind of one last escape. She climbed the gates of the convent and ran and went to New York and met with her good friend who was relatively high up in the Near East Relief organization. This organization basically helped fund the film, but also helped Aurora a lot when she first arrived to the States. And she was also in shock. She had no idea. So not even Near East Relief knew about these lookalikes at all. And this is where suddenly we see Aurora kind of get a bit more empowered with this. And in a way, this is a little bit of chapter 3 where we actually figure out who Aurora was as a person. This is also where we kind of dig into the archives a tiny bit more. She decides to sue her guardian. She decides to sue Eleanor Gates. As we can see by the title, Armenian refugee got $15 a week as start of film play. Again, also good in a sense of confirming that the $15 a week was very much true fact. Girl says Guardian saved only $195 of $7,000 paid for production, aka she was owed $7,000 and she was only given $195. Also with the $15 a week, just to put it into context in terms of how much that was, it was to actually pay for a ticket for some of the cinemas, it was pretty expensive. It was $10 a ticket, which is, I'd say, quite expensive even now, a tiny bit. You'd probably choose like a Barbican Monday to have a fiver. So yeah, this $15 was practically nothing. But she sued, and Eleanor Gates tried to say kind of the reason we had to spend all that $7,000 was because we had to get chauffeurs and we had to get the lookalikes, etc. Thankfully, the judge wasn't having any of it, and Aurora won the case, and she got the $7,000 she should have had before. And then I wanted to do some more digging. I was like, if there's court proceedings, it tends to mean that there's also some more kind of archives out there, which isn't just newspaper clippings. So then I found this, and this is basically again confirmation that Eleanor Gates was the guardian of Aurora. I kept on digging, and then I managed to find this. And these were more court proceedings back in August 1920. And I was reading, I think I got sent about 40 pages worth of things, and quite a few interesting things. But then something really stuck out to me, and it was the petition of Aurora Mardiganian respectfully shows, point 3, that your petitioner is without funds and without employment at this time, as a result of which she has become indebted for room and board for herself and for certain tuition charges at the school where her sister is attending. I don't understand fully what that sentence was, but I definitely understood the very last bit, where her sister is attending. In the book, we see basically her sisters perishing when they got thrown off the board, as I mentioned earlier. With the Armenian Film Foundation, she doesn't mention her sisters, and the friends I spoke to also really didn't mention sisters. There's also one more archive at the Zorian Institute in Canada. They also did a testimony with her. Sadly, I can't access the archive. You have to be in Canada and also have special permission. With Martin Habanian, and they had a son 2 years later. They lived in New York for a couple decades in the Bronx. She worked at a dressmaking factory. She decided to continue with her kind of activist ways, and she went to her boss and she was like, I'm gonna strike. I'm not getting paid enough. This is not right. It worked. She managed to get paid more, and she actually helped start one of the first unions in America as well. So, she kept on having this kind of determination in her, which was just amazing. But I still wanted to find out slightly more, so I managed to get in contact with some of her kind of friends or people who knew her. Now, obviously, this is very difficult. She passed in 1994, sorry, and she wasn't the kind of person who went out all the time and kind of made friends everywhere, because she was deeply traumatized. I remember Anthony Slide telling me how if someone knocks on her door, it would take her 5 minutes to even open it, because she thought it was the Turks coming to get her. And we heard a very similar thing in the previous snippet while in the filming. She was going through this paranoia for basically 70 years. But I did find a few people, and I wanted to read out some of their quotes, which were about her. So give me 10 seconds, and I will get it up. So this is Susan Iranyan, who was the nurse that cared for her in 1994. And I had the luck to meet Mrs. Aurora. She was one of my patients, and I clearly remember her room number and her bed. She was in room 12, bed A. The sad part was, first of all, no one knew her story at the time. We never thought that she's the lady who survived the genocide, and her entire whole story after that. She didn't have any family visiting, and Aurora became our home. We were her family. Aurora is the kind of care home in California. This is a filmmaker who worked for the Zorin Institute. He was great, loved him. His quotes were brilliant. You had me and Dr. Rubin look at each other, and we said, what? How could we have missed this? When we met her, how did we not know her before? We researched and we were really surprised that everything was true. She wanted justice, to know what really had happened, but all her life she fought for it. And at that age, she was very courageous, and explaining what she had seen and never budging, never retreating, always telling the truth. And the last one, Annie, who was a very, very close friend of Aurora, and she was the one who wrote the essay, and she used to come to her house every week. She kept it all. And when I'd enter her home, the floor to the ceiling was full of boxes of her belongings and of her life. And then in the living room, there were tables. Tables that were covered with trinkets and with stacks of papers. I think about it. I think about the stories each of those mementos would tell. And they were endless. She had a son and grandson whom she adored. But that son didn't seem to care. She told me she loved them, but they weren't really a part of her life. And she told me once in a while, maybe once a week or so, he would bring her groceries and set them at the side of the kitchen, not even unloading them. He did not share the love of a son and a mother, it seemed to me. She wanted so deeply and desperately to share her world, but to protect her world. But when someone showed interest in her world, she poured it out. And with that, I also found out her family kind of seemed to follow this trend. They weren't close. And she passed away in 1994, aged 93. Nobody collected her body for 3 years, no family member collected her body, and she got put into a mass grave, basically. And I thought maybe there's still some family out there, who knows? So I tried to do some digging, and I managed to find the grandson. And the grandson currently lives in Hawaii, owns a bar and a construction company, as you do. And he didn't have any form of online presence, so I messaged the bar. It was a very weird message, being like, hey, I know your grandmother, maybe. Even weirder when a staff responds to it, being like, I have no idea who this is. But I got somewhere, and then they just basically ghosted me entirely. And then I managed to find a friend of his. And he was like, yeah, of course, I'll go speak to him. And then I got a message back, a very stern response, being like, he does not want to talk, and he just blocked me. And I was like, okay, fair enough. And it kind of saddened me. I don't know how much he knows about her story. I don't know how much his daughter, so her great-granddaughter, knows about her story. Because without her, and without her resilience, they wouldn't be there. But we also need to respect, generational trauma is a very real thing. And also she was extremely paranoid, and I can imagine it also wasn't easy to be within that family too. But I don't want to end on, with her story on too much of a depressing note. I remember at AI, at the Armenian Institute before my talk, 3 days before, I got sent an email. Being like, hey, I see that you're doing this talk. I actually found a bunch of photos of Aurora that I think my dad took. And I was like, oh, amazing, please send them over. And she sent me a bunch. And here's just a small collection of it. And it was the first time ever I saw kind of more candid photos of her. And also I think the first time ever I saw Aurora actually smiling. Like you don't tend to see that reaction in her testimonies, etc. And no wonder, because she's talking about such a gruesome and depressing thing. And like on the left, you can see that's the Auction of Souls, the movie poster. And yeah, this just kind of brought some kind of happiness to me, some relief to me. And in a way, this comes to our like next point, and how just archiving is so important, because it truly tells the whole story. Now, I wrote this down last night, and it would be a disservice if I forgot it, so hence I wrote it down. But telling this story would not have been possible at all without archives. From more common archives like newspaper clippings to more purposeful archives like oral testimonies, I can't stress enough how important creating archives is. They give evidence and provide gaps in history. It can counter historical bias that we very much often see. Finding more local archives such as diaries, photos, help us provide some form of history and honour. And we basically honour their memories in a way. So making sure we also create future archives is so important to this day. It's not just about preserving current archives, it's also making sure that you create an archive now, so in 50 years' time, it's just unbelievably important. So I wanted to ask a question to you all, I tried to be very Gen Z with this. What are archives? Can you give me examples of archives? Don't be shy, guys. So this could, I'm not going to give any answers just yet.
Kid music can be music, songs, all of these, art in general.
Yeah.
Personal writing, stories, basically.
Personal writing, so like diary entries in a way.
Letters.
Yeah, diary entries, letters. It worked. Yeah, exactly. So just a couple of examples of diary entries that have become super useful for us to know about certain historical contexts. Any others?
Photo albums.
Photo albums, exactly.
Podcasts.
Photo albums, podcasts, super important. Again, photo albums is a great example of like preserving previous history, but also preserving current history right now as well. Any others? One more, and then I'll go through some of the others.
Audio recordings.
Audio recordings. Love that. I'm glad that I put that one down. Yeah, exactly. Data interview, 40 days, such an important interview for us. The Tahir protests from an online archive. So I think the archive is called 858.ma, and basically it's 858 hours of footage. And it's people's footage, people's camera phones. And it's all categorized metadata, and it's an amazing piece of work. And it's so important because we actually see what's going on from a person's perspective. Some other ones that I put down were food recipes. Such a good way of actually figuring out kind of potentially signs you can figure out where your family member might have come from just from a food recipe book. Legal records. I would not have had any idea about this sister if it wasn't for that. Posters, diary entries, as we said, newspaper clippings, of course, like a very well-known ones, from interesting advertisements, court proceedings. Back then you also had births, marriages, deaths, like notices. And you had very bizarre notices like, any debt or debts contracted by my wife, Mary Ann Sharman, after this notice will not be paid by her husband. So, okay, thank you. Photo albums, as we said, and also clothing textiles. Again, something that really provides us with a lot of information. Now, all of you should have a little postcard thing. And on one half, you're going to write something down. And the question is, what archive do you have of yourself? Feel free, you can also go in like groups of 2 or 3 and also talk about it. We'll do this for like 2-3 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next question as well. archives that you have. Yeah, exactly. It could be anything. Think outside the box. Of yourself or something you might own which is of other people as well.